Ethiopia is aspired to be the beacon of African prosperity by 2030. To realize this ambitious plan, the Ministry of Plan and Development of Ethiopia has set up a 10 years economic prospective plan. The incumbent administration of Ethiopia chose inward, looking through introducing a homegrown economic strategy to boost the economy of the country. This strategy dictates that the country should rely on its own blessings than relying on foreign aid and donation.
Beyond importing wheat and even beyond farming for food self-sufficiency, many within us, our people and others had doubted the possibility of us working to export our produce, which was against all odds. In this summer season alone, they have farmed 250,000 hectares of wheat.
Wheat's simple, ordinary, everywhere. But this time, wheat became the center of a global upset. Ethiopia has just said no to a huge US grain deal, stunning markets and triggering worldwide debate. Was it a mistake or a master move to protect its farmers and rewrite Africa's economic future? The answer might change how the world sees food, power, and sovereignty.
The announcement came like a shockwave rippling across global markets, diplomatic circles, and agricultural analysts who had grown accustomed to the belief that major grain-importing nations would always rely on the world's top exporters. When Ethiopia publicly declined a massive wheat deal offered by the United States, the world paused. Governments scrambled for explanations. Major companies watched the grain market tighten, and global media rushed to interpret the meaning behind the move. Yet on the ground in Ethiopia, the decision was neither impulsive nor surprising. It was the culmination of years of quiet agricultural ambition, strategic reforms, and a national vision built around one idea: food independence. For years, Ethiopia had been seen primarily as a recipient of imported grain, a country perceived as vulnerable to drought and reliant on external assistance. That narrative was convenient for global exporters and international suppliers who benefited from predictable, long-term contracts. But within Ethiopia, a transformation had quietly begun. Vast agricultural fields were being rehabilitated. Irrigation projects were expanding with unprecedented speed. Local seed varieties were being re-engineered for resilience and abundance. Farming cooperatives were growing more organized, supported by new technologies and government investment. The Ethiopia the world thought it knew no longer existed. The rejected wheat deal, valued at billions and backed by some of the largest grain exporters in the United States, was intended to secure long-term dependence. Its size alone made it appear irresistible. Enough wheat to stabilize market prices, reinforce predictable imports, and position the United States as Ethiopia's primary agricultural partner for years. Yet that was precisely the problem. Ethiopia's government saw the offer not as assistance, but as a subtle mechanism of control. Accepting it would risk undermining domestic wheat production just as farmers were reaching new heights of productivity. It would anchor the country to external supply chains that could shift with global politics. For Ethiopia, the timing could not have been worse or more revealing. Instead, Ethiopia made a dramatic choice. It turned down the deal and reaffirmed its commitment to cultivating its own food systems. The message was unmistakable. The country was moving toward agricultural independence, no matter who was watching. Around the world, reactions erupted instantly. Grain exporting companies in the United States assessed what the loss meant for their long-term projections. Several African governments saw the decision as symbolic, a sign that deep economic change was accelerating across the continent. Analysts in Europe speculated about wider effects on global food security and market stability. In Asia, emerging agricultural powers observed quietly, calculating how Ethiopia's stance could create new alliances and disrupt old ones. Global observers understood immediately that this was not just about wheat. It was about sovereignty. It was about a country choosing to walk a path few believed it could take. It was about Africa, long treated as a passive participant in world trade, asserting control over its own resources. The move signaled the rise of a new philosophy, that African countries could reorient their economies away from dependency and toward internal strength. It suggested that agricultural power was shifting gradually but unmistakably toward the African continent. Ethiopia had become the unexpected face of that shift, not through speeches or declarations, but through a single, decisive refusal. The global wheat market had rarely experienced such a symbolic tremor. Major suppliers in the United States had long operated with a sense of inevitability. Nations needing grain would purchase it, and those purchases would reinforce existing hierarchies. Ethiopia's refusal disrupted that rhythm. For exporters, it introduced a dangerous question. What if other nations followed? What if African countries, long targeted as stable markets for imported grain, began choosing domestic production instead? As markets reacted, Ethiopia's agricultural fields told a different story. Local farmers, once overshadowed by cheap foreign imports, were now rising to national prominence. The government had invested heavily in modern processing facilities that could transform locally grown wheat into high-quality flour. New cooperatives brought farmers together to negotiate fair prices. Young entrepreneurs were turning agricultural innovation into growing businesses, designing new storage systems, irrigation technology, and transportation platforms that connected remote regions to thriving urban markets. By rejecting the U.S. deal, Ethiopia sent a direct message to its own agricultural workforce. It affirmed that their labor, their land, and their crops mattered more than foreign contracts. This internal confidence sparked renewed energy in rural communities. Farmers who had once felt overshadowed by international suppliers now saw themselves as key actors in a national transformation. Agricultural training centers expanded, offering programs on modern cultivation methods, soil management, and climate-adapted farming. The confidence of farmers began reflecting the confidence of the nation. The political implications of the rejection reached far beyond Ethiopia's borders. For decades, many African nations had grown accustomed to relying on Western grain as a buffer against drought or political instability. Ethiopia's decision signaled that this pattern no longer had to define the continent's future. The refusal became more than a trade choice. It became a symbol of sovereignty. Within African economic blocs, discussions intensified about strengthening regional food systems and reducing dependency on external suppliers. Ethiopia's example inspired new debates about the future of agricultural policy across the continent. Some governments began re-examining their reliance on imported grain, wondering whether they, too, could transition toward localized production. Agricultural research institutions across Africa took note, exploring new ways to develop drought-resistant varieties, strengthen water management, and improve soil conservation. Meanwhile, international observers attempted to interpret Ethiopia's strategy. Some saw it as a bold assertion of independence. Others viewed it as a gamble that could backfire if droughts returned or if local harvests fell short. But the Ethiopian government appeared unfazed by these warnings. Its officials spoke confidently about expanding agricultural self-reliance, integrating emerging technologies, and improving water management. The message was consistent. Even if the path proved difficult, the country was determined to walk it. This commitment reshaped Ethiopia's diplomatic relationships. Countries in the Middle East, Asia, and Eastern Europe expressed interest in forming new agricultural partnerships. Some offered advanced irrigation technology. Others proposed joint investments in processing plants or training programs. Unlike the U.S. wheat deal, these partnerships were structured around mutual growth rather than long-term dependency. Ethiopia's negotiators embraced them as opportunities to accelerate the country's agricultural modernization. Inside global media spaces, the story evolved quickly. Commentators framed Ethiopia's rejection as an act of defiance against powerful agricultural exporters. Some described it as the beginning of a larger geopolitical realignment in Africa. Others highlighted how it challenged old assumptions about development. The narrative that once portrayed African countries as permanent importers now faced serious revision. In many African nations, citizens celebrated the move as a sign of a rising continent. Social platforms erupted with debates about the future of African agriculture, with many arguing that Ethiopia had demonstrated what was possible. Though challenges remained, climate unpredictability, infrastructure gaps, and global market volatility, the decision stood as a bold example of what could be achieved with determination and strategic planning. What made Ethiopia's move so remarkable was not simply the rejection of a deal, but the refusal to accept a future shaped by external powers. It marked a turning point in how African countries approached trade negotiations. For decades, Deals were structured with the assumption that African nations would accept whatever terms were offered because alternatives were scarce. Ethiopia showed that alternatives did exist and that they could be built internally. The decision also exposed the hidden vulnerabilities of global grain markets. If a major importer could suddenly withdraw from trade, what would stop others? What would prevent African regional blocs from producing and trading among themselves instead of relying on global exporters? Ethiopia's stance introduced a new uncertainty into global supply chains that had long been considered stable. The effects were not merely symbolic. In agricultural exchanges, commodity markets responded with tension as analysts recalculated global demand projections. U.S. exporters worked quickly to find new buyers to absorb the surplus. But the message lingered. The old assumptions were no longer reliable. Ethiopia's agricultural reforms continued accelerating. The country invested heavily in technology-driven monitoring systems that allowed farmers to track soil quality, rainfall patterns, and crop growth with unprecedented accuracy. Digital tools connected smallholder farmers to larger markets, strengthening rural economies and reducing post-harvest losses. New storage facilities reduced the waste that had historically undermined food security. Each improvement reinforced the belief that the country could not only sustain itself, but potentially become a regional supplier. As the global wheat market adjusted, Ethiopia reemerged on the world stage not as a dependent buyer, but as an example of agricultural transformation. Governments that once overlooked Ethiopia's farming potential now viewed the country as a case study in self-reliance. Agricultural conferences highlighted its success as evidence that bold policy shifts could alter national destinies. The U.S. wheat deal became a distant symbol of an era ending. Though the offer was large, it was ultimately no match for the vision Ethiopia held for its future. The country's strategy was not motivated by defiance, but by determination. It was driven by a belief that ownership of food systems was directly tied to sovereignty, economic strength, and national dignity. In the months that followed the rejection, Ethiopia's local wheat production continued rising, supplying markets that once relied heavily on imports. Bakeries in major cities proudly displayed signs indicating they used domestically grown wheat. Farmers' cooperatives expanded their memberships. Agricultural schools reported record enrollment as young people saw new opportunity in the sector. The country embraced the narrative of becoming a regional breadbasket, a role once unimaginable but increasingly plausible. Around the world, the decision continued sparking debates about the future of global food systems. Development experts questioned whether decades of reliance on external grain had slowed innovation in African agriculture. Economists discussed whether the global grain market was prepared for a future in which African nations reduced imports. Environmental analysts praised Ethiopia's focus on sustainable farming and climate-resilient crops. The global upset that followed the rejection was not a moment of chaos, but a moment of clarity. It revealed that food dependency was not an inevitability, but a condition shaped by historical decisions, global power structures, and economic pressure. Ethiopia showed that changing course required not just policy shifts, but courage. In the end, the country demonstrated something profound, that sovereignty could be cultivated, seed by seed, field by field, harvest by harvest. And in doing so, it inspired a new chapter in Africa's economic story, one defined not by dependency, but by resilience, ambition, and the possibility of true independence. As Ethiopia's agricultural momentum accelerated, new economic opportunities emerged across the rural landscape. Entire communities that had once faced chronic shortages now found themselves participating in supply chains that extended far beyond their regions. Small-scale millers expanded operations, purchasing equipment that allowed them to process greater quantities of grain. Transport companies adapted routes to accommodate increased movement between farms and markets, fostering a more resilient domestic trade network. International corporations observed these changes with growing caution. For decades, they had relied on predictable patterns. Nations faced with drought or instability would inevitably turn to foreign suppliers. Ethiopia's model challenged these assumptions head-on. Countries in Latin America, South Asia, and the Middle East began studying Ethiopia's methods, exploring whether similar reforms could reduce their own dependency on imports. Agricultural research organizations initiated partnerships with Ethiopia's institutions, keen to understand the policy framework that allowed such rapid transformation. The country's strategy also shed light on the broader geopolitical implications of food independence. Historically, nations that controlled grain exports held significant influence in global diplomacy. Food aid, trade agreements, and long-term supply contracts often shaped political alliances. By rejecting the wheat deal, Ethiopia disrupted this pattern, signaling that it would no longer participate in arrangements that compromised sovereignty for short-term gain. This shift forced traditional exporters to reconsider how they approached Africa, a continent that was no longer willing to be defined by dependency. Within Africa, Ethiopia's agricultural rise encouraged regional conversations about collaborative production and intercontinental trade. Countries with complementary climates discussed joint farming projects capable of stabilizing regional food systems. Some proposed continental grain reserves, while others suggested shared agricultural research networks. Ethiopia's success demonstrated that African nations could support one another without relying heavily on distant markets. This idea gained momentum as governments recalibrated their development priorities. Back home, the transformation inspired a cultural shift as well. Local cuisine, once dominated by imported ingredients due to availability and cost, began celebrating domestic wheat. Restaurants showcased dishes made exclusively with Ethiopian grain. Markets proudly labeled local products, and culinary festivals highlighted the diversity of wheat varieties grown across the country. This new appreciation for domestic food production strengthened national identity, reinforcing the belief that Ethiopia's future belonged to its own people. Even global financial institutions took notice. Though some analysts initially warned that rejecting such a large deal could weaken Ethiopia's economy, the opposite seemed increasingly true. By prioritizing domestic production, the country reduced foreign exchange pressure and strengthened local industries. Investors from Asia and the Middle East began exploring opportunities in Ethiopia's agricultural sector, seeking to build processing centers, storage complexes, and irrigation systems in partnership with local companies. The more the world scrutinized Ethiopia's agricultural rise, the clearer it became that the country's strategy was not merely about wheat. It was about redefining economic relationships and challenging assumptions that had guided global policy for decades. Ethiopia had chosen a path that placed long-term national benefit above immediate convenience. Instead of accepting the sweeping influence of major exporters, it embraced a future built on self-reliance, innovation, and regional cooperation. The United States, for its part, reassessed its approach to African agricultural partnerships. Corporations and trade officials evaluated how the loss of Ethiopia's market would affect long-term strategy. Some argued for more flexible, collaborative agreements that respected local production goals. Others warned that Ethiopia's rejection might inspire other nations to follow suit, jeopardizing lucrative export pathways. The debate highlighted the shifting terrain of global trade, where influence was no longer guaranteed. Ethiopia's stance also provoked conversations within climate and environmental sectors. By focusing on domestic production and investing in climate-resilient agriculture, the country positioned itself as a potential leader in sustainable farming. Experts pointed out that growing wheat closer to home reduced the carbon footprint associated with long-distance shipping. Water-efficient irrigation systems and soil restoration programs further strengthened Ethiopia's environmental profile, positioning the country as a model for climate-smart agriculture. Despite international skepticism, Ethiopia's vision held firm. The country continued to expand research into high-yield varieties capable of surviving erratic weather patterns. Agricultural universities partnered with regional institutions to develop new technologies tailored to African environments. Young innovators created platforms that connected farmers with millers and distributors, reducing inefficiencies and ensuring that locally grown wheat reached consumers quickly and reliably. As months turned into years, Ethiopia's early gamble began to look increasingly prescient. Nations that once viewed the rejection as risky now saw it as forward-thinking. Import reliance, once seen as a safety net, had proven vulnerable to global disruptions such as pandemics, shipping delays, and geopolitical tensions. Ethiopia's model offered an alternative, one built on internal stability rather than external uncertainty. Ultimately, The story of Ethiopia's rejection of the U.S. wheat deal transcended economics. It became a demonstration of how a nation could rewrite its own narrative. Instead of accepting a predetermined role in the global system, Ethiopia crafted a new identity as a leader in agricultural independence. Its journey illustrated the power of long-term vision, strategic courage, and national unity. The global upset that began with a single refusal grew into a wider movement. Across Africa, countries watched Ethiopia's transformation with renewed curiosity and inspiration. The decision sparked discussions about food sovereignty, regional cooperation, and the importance of controlling one's resources. In classrooms, community halls, and political forums, a new question took root. If Ethiopia could change its destiny through agriculture, what else was possible for the continent? In this way, Ethiopia's story became not only about wheat, but about the future of African development. It invited nations to imagine an economy where self-sufficiency replaced dependency, where innovation replaced complacency, and where the continent's vast potential could finally be cultivated to its fullest extent. Ethiopia had shown the world that even the most entrenched global systems could be challenged, and that sometimes, all it took was the courage to say no. This shift continues shaping Africa's future with resilience, confidence, and determination.